The summer he first noticed her, Owen had already made peace with the idea that the house next door would stay empty forever. He hadn't meant to look. That was the part that stayed with him later, when the whole thing had settled into something warm and certain. He hadn't stood at the kitchen window with any particular intention. He was just a man holding a mug of coffee that had gone mostly cold, watching the light change over a backyard that wasn't his when she walked out onto the porch next door and pulled the screen door shut behind her like she'd done it 1,000 times before. And maybe that was the thing that got him. She didn't look new to the house. She looked like she belonged to it, and the house had been waiting for her to remember that. Owen Callard was 43 years old. He refinished furniture for a living, stripping old pieces down to their original grain, reading the wood, deciding what it could survive. He had been doing it for 11 years out of a converted garage attached to the house he'd bought after his marriage ended. His ex-wife, Karen, had been a kind woman who'd grown tired of being kind to him specifically. The divorce had been quiet and correct. He still thought about her sometimes the way you think about a well-made chair you'd had to get rid of because the room changed. No bitterness, just the particular weight of a thing being gone. He lived alone. He had a dog named Fletcher who was 13 years old and deeply opinionated about where he slept. He had a morning routine that almost never changed. He had neighbors on the left who waved and neighbors on the right whose porch had sat empty since the Hendersons moved to Tucson the previous October. That was 9 months of a mailbox he occasionally checked to keep the flyers from stacking, a driveway he snow blew twice as a courtesy to no one, and a yard whose grass he'd watched grow and go ragged before the management company finally sent someone to cut it. And then the truck came on a Tuesday morning, and the house stopped being empty. He hadn't paid much attention at first. He'd heard the engine, seen the flash of a moving van through his kitchen window, and gone back to his work. He was in the middle of bringing a mid-century sideboard back from something that looked like a barn fire, and the job needed his full attention. He sanded for 2 hours. He applied a first coat of stripper and let it breathe. He walked Fletcher around the block, and when he came back he saw the van was already half unloaded, and a woman was directing 2 movers with the calm authority of someone who had done this before and found it mildly annoying. He didn't look closely. He noted medium height, dark hair pulled up into something fast and practical, a gray sweater with a fraying cuff. She was carrying a lamp under one arm and pointing at the porch steps with her free hand. He walked Fletcher past and went inside. It was 4 days later when he really saw her. He'd been at the kitchen window again, his unofficial observation post, though he would have denied calling it that, when she came out the back door and crossed her yard to stand at the fence between their properties. She had a coffee mug in both hands and she was looking at his back garden with an expression he couldn't entirely read from this distance. Curious, maybe? Measuring something. Fletcher was asleep on the porch steps behind Owen, twitching through a dream, and the yard was quiet except for the sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. Owen watched her for what was probably longer than he should have. There was something about the way she stood that was different from how people usually stood in their own backyards. She wasn't restless. She wasn't checking her phone. She was just standing there in the Saturday morning light, holding her mug, and apparently thinking about something that required looking at his garden to think about properly. Then she looked up. Directly at the window. Directly at him. Owen did not step back fast enough. She held his gaze for one long moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved, and she said something he couldn't hear through the glass but could read clearly enough. He felt the heat climb the back of his neck as he opened the back door. Fletcher raised his head, decided it wasn't worth the effort, and went back to sleep. "Morning," Owen said, crossing the porch to the fence, because it was the only word he had available that wasn't an apology. She looked at him from the other side of the fence with those steady eyes and said, "No need to sneak a look. You're allowed to wave." Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 40 years old. She had moved from the city after ending a 4-year engagement to a man she described when Owen eventually got around to asking as someone who confused being comfortable with being happy. She was a structural engineer by training and by inclination. She had an opinion about his back porch steps that she delivered within 6 minutes of their first real conversation, specifically that the third one from the bottom was bowed and had been compensating for a compromised footing that was going to fail inside of 18 months. She said it the way someone states a professional opinion when they have decided to stop keeping it to themselves. "I've been watching that step for a month," Owen said. "Watching it isn't fixing it," she said, and smiled in a way that made it clear she wasn't being unkind. Fletcher had limped over to the fence by then and was pressing his nose into her offered hand with the confidence of an elderly dog who is determined that most strangers are worth greeting. "He's a good judge," Owen said. "Of? Things worth his time." She looked at him again with that same measuring expression she'd had when she was studying his garden. She said, "Your hosta beds are overwatered. I know. And the step is going to go. I know that too. Most people, she said, who know things like that, fix them. Most people, he said, haven't been standing at a kitchen window watching their own property since 7:30 in the morning. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, short and clean. Fletcher wagged once, approving. The following Saturday, Owen replaced the porch step. He didn't plan the timing. He just went out at 9 in the morning with his tools and the white oak he'd been keeping in the back of the garage for a project that hadn't materialized, and he set to work. At some point around 11, he became aware that Ruth was in her backyard, deadheading her roses with a focused economy of motion, not looking at him, which meant she was very aware of him. He kept working. Fletcher observed from the porch, rotating slowly like a compass needle, following the warmth. When Owen was almost done, he heard the screen door on her side of the fence, and then she was leaning on the fence post with a glass of water in each hand, and she held one across the fence toward him without a word. He took it. He drank about half of it. He said, "White oak. Should outlast us both." She looked at the step. She looked at the wood grain. She said, "Quarter sawn? You can tell?" "Medullary rays," she said, and tapped the surface with one finger. "Nice choice for exterior." Owen looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "How does a structural engineer end up in a house like this?" She leaned on the fence post a little more comfortably, like the question had been waiting and she'd already thought about how to answer it. She said the city apartment had been her fiancé's idea, and then staying in it had been her trying to hold on to the idea of the person she'd thought she was when she agreed to live there. Coming here was the first decision she'd made in about 3 years that was entirely her own. She said it without any performance of emotion. She just said it the way you report a structural finding. "This is what happened. This is what I found. This is the load-bearing part." "Do you miss it?" Owen asked. "The city or the engagement?" "Either." She considered this with visible seriousness. "I miss the coffee shop on the corner. I don't miss any of the rest of it." She picked up her glass from where she'd set it on the fence rail. "You? Miss what?" "Whatever it was you had before this." He thought about it honestly. He said, "I miss being understood on the first try. I don't miss much else." Ruth looked at him steadily. She said, "That's a very specific thing to miss." "It's an accurate thing," he said. She nodded slowly, the way someone does when they're filing something. She picked up his empty glass from the rail without asking, took both glasses back to her side of the fence, and went inside without overdoing the goodbye. Owen sat on the new step and finished driving the last screw and thought about nothing in particular. Summer settled into its long evenings. The rhythm of it changed, slowly and without announcement. Owen found reasons to be in the backyard more often than he had been in the previous 11 years of living there. Ruth was in hers with similar regularity. They were not precious about it. They talked over the fence the way neighbors do when the talking has started to feel natural, about the weather that was too hot, about the raccoon that had found her compost, about a client of Owen's who had brought him a Victorian writing desk that had clearly been used at some point as a doghouse. She always had something dry to say. She always said it without trying to be funny, which was the thing that made it funny. The evening he discovered she had quietly restaked the leaning rose arbor on her side of the shared fence using the same technique his own fence posts were anchored with, he stood and looked at it for a moment and then looked at her and said, "You looked at my fence posts." She said, "I look at everything." "That's either reassuring or alarming." "Depends on what shape you're in," she said, and didn't look up from the trowel she was cleaning. He was standing there trying to think of an answer to that when a car pulled up in front of her house and a man got out. The man was around 45, wearing clothes that looked like they had been carefully assembled to appear casual. He had the particular ease of someone who expected to be looked at and found the expectation reasonable. He stood at the end of Ruth's front walk and called her name as though the house were a lobby and she were supposed to appear. Owen watched from the backyard. Ruth walked to the front gate without hurrying. She did not open it. She said something Owen couldn't hear from this distance. The man outside responded with a gesture that suggested he found her position at the gate to be unnecessary. He smiled. It was a practiced smile. He said something again. He pointed at the house, then at himself, then at Ruth in a way that was mapping some kind of shared ownership onto the property that did not belong to him. Owen moved through his side gate and around to his own front porch, which gave him an unobstructed line of sight and plausible deniability. The man outside the gate was saying in a voice that carried its own perfect reasonableness like a weapon, "Ruth, I'm not here to argue. I just thought we could have a conversation as adults." Ruth said, "We are having a conversation. This is what I look like when I'm done." The man's eyes traveled up the block in a way that made it clear he was looking for an audience that wasn't there, and then they landed on Owen on his porch. His expression recalibrated. He straightened slightly. He said, "Friend of yours?" Ruth looked at Owen. Owen looked at the man. Owen said, "Neighbor." He said it with no particular inflection. He said it the way you identify a piece of furniture. The man seemed to decide that the audience was unhelpful. He said something quieter to Ruth that Owen couldn't hear. Ruth listened to it with the patience of a building inspector reviewing a report she has already decided to reject. Then she said, "Goodbye, Daniel," and turned back toward her house. Daniel stood at the gate for a moment too long. Then he got in his car and drove away. The car was very expensive and very quiet, and somehow both of those things were irritating. Owen sat down on his porch step. Ruth came around the side of the house a few minutes later and leaned against his fence post, arms crossed. She said, "Thank you for being inconvenient." "I wasn't doing anything." "Exactly," she said. He looked at her. She looked steadily back. She said, "He's the kind of man who needs an exit strategy. You gave him one that wasn't humiliating." That was actually thoughtful. "I wasn't thinking about him," Owen said. She was quiet for a moment. Fletcher had materialized at her feet from some direction and was leaning his old weight against her leg. She said, "He does that every couple of months. Decides that the most reasonable version of me would see his side of it." "What's his side of it?" "That I made a practical mistake and he's the practical correction." She said it without venom, just assessment. He's not wrong that the engagement made sense on paper. He just never understood that paper isn't what I'm made of. Owen looked at her in the evening light. He said, "What are you made of?" She looked at him with those measuring eyes, and then she said something that he thought about for a long time afterward. She said, "Something that needs to choose, not something that gets selected because the numbers work." The evenings got longer, and then they got shorter again, the way evenings do. Fletcher turned 14 and slept longer and harder. Owen finished the barn fire sideboard and started on a set of library shelves for a client in the next town. Ruth redesigned her back garden in what she called an empirical way, and which Owen thought was the most engineered patio layout he had ever seen a human being commit to for personal, aesthetic reasons. He did not say this out loud. He thought it twice a day and kept it to himself. The night it changed was ordinary in its setup. He had been invited to a fundraiser dinner by his brother Marco, who sat on the board of the County Historical Society and periodically required Owen's presence for events that benefited from having someone there who looked comfortable at a table. Owen had said yes 6 weeks in advance and regretted it with increasing sincerity as the date approached. He mentioned it to Ruth over the fence that morning, not to complain but because he was thinking out loud about whether his one good sport coat still fit across the shoulders. She said, "When is it?" "Tonight." She looked at him. "And you're telling me about the jacket at 8 in the morning? I'm hoping the problem will resolve itself." She said, "Do you want company or do you want to suffer alone?" He looked at her. She held his look without any performance of casualness. She said, "I've been to exactly one event since I moved here, and it was a city council meeting about parking ordinances. I could use a legitimate dinner." Owen said, "It's a fundraiser. Historical Society. Likely to involve at least one slide presentation about Victorian brickwork." "I'm a structural engineer," she said. "I find Victorian brickwork interesting." He said, "I'll drive." She said, "I know." The dinner was in a converted granary that the Historical Society had been restoring for 3 years, and it was lovelier inside than Owen had expected. His brother Marco found them within 45 seconds of their arrival with the unerring instinct of a man who has spent years scanning rooms for interesting developments. Marco looked at Ruth. He looked at Owen. He said, "Well," with a great deal of meaning compressed into one syllable. Owen said, "This is Ruth, my neighbor." Marco said, "Of course she is," in a way that made it clear he didn't believe neighbor was the complete description but was too socially skilled to say so. Ruth shook his hand and said she'd read an article about the granary restoration and had a question about the lintel situation on the east facade. Marco was charmed immediately and hopelessly and took her away to meet the architect for 6 minutes while Owen got 2 glasses of wine and waited. She came back with notes she'd taken on her phone and an expression of moderate satisfaction. He gave her the wine. She said, "The lintel solution is elegant. The architect made a choice I wouldn't have made, and it's going to be fine." "High praise," Owen said. "It's accurate praise." She looked around the room. "Your brother watches you. He's always done that, like he's waiting for something to happen. He's been waiting for 11 years. She looked at him. "What happened 11 years ago?" "I bought the house," Owen said. "Alone." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That must have seemed final." "It seemed correct," he said. "At the time. And now?" He looked at her. She was watching him with those direct, unhurried eyes, holding her wine glass by the stem, standing close enough that he could see the small scar on her chin from something she'd mentioned once, an engineering field visit gone briefly wrong. He said, now I replaced the porch step and my hosta beds are less overwatered and I have a neighbor who knows what quarter sawn oak looks like. She smiled. Not the short, sharp smile. A different one. A quieter one. The slide presentation on Victorian brickwork did materialize, and it was 20 minutes long, and Ruth sat beside him with her arm touching his from shoulder to elbow and asked the presenter 2 questions that were better than any the presenter had probably received in the previous 5 years. Owen watched her ask them and thought about the word careful. He thought sometimes careful is just fear with better manners, and then he thought that was exactly where he'd been for 11 years. The drive home was mostly quiet. The good kind. Fletcher was asleep inside when they arrived, and the neighborhood was dark except for the streetlights and the lamp Ruth had left on in her front window. She stood on the sidewalk between their houses. She said, that was genuinely a good evening. Victorian brickwork and everything. Especially that. She looked at her porch and then she looked back at him. She said, Owen, can I ask you something? He said, after tonight I feel like I should be nervous. She said, you probably should. She looked at him steadily. Are you always this careful? He said, depends what I'm trying not to break. She didn't answer right away. The lamp in her window made a warm rectangle on the porch boards. When she looked at him again, her expression had settled into something he recognized the way you recognize a wood grain you've read before, something old and straight and reliable. She said, for the record, I'm not made of glass. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, I know that. She said, then stop measuring so much. He stepped forward. She met him halfway. It was not a dramatic thing. It was a quiet thing, the way the best structural decisions are quiet. You make the right joint and everything else holds. She pulled back just enough to look at him. She said, I've been watching that window since the first week. The kitchen window? You make terrible coffee, she said. You let it go cold every single morning. He laughed, and it surprised him, and she smiled at the surprise. Marco called the next morning, 7 minutes before Owen had been awake long enough to form a complete sentence. He said, so, Owen said, goodbye, Marco. Marco said, she asked the lintel question for you. Engineers don't ask structural questions to impress architects. They ask them to have something to do with their hands while they're deciding something. Owen said, goodbye, Marco, and meant it a little less the second time. Daniel came back once more, in October, on a gray afternoon when the leaves were coming down. Ruth was in her front garden and Owen was on his porch, because he had started spending more time on his porch when she was in her garden, and this had ceased to be a coincidence anyone was pretending about. Daniel stood at the gate again. He looked at Owen on the porch. He looked at Ruth. He said something quiet and reasonable, the way he always did. Ruth said, Daniel, I'm going to need you to stop deciding what I need and start respecting that I've already decided. She said it gently, but without any available argument in it. I wish you well. I mean that. Daniel stood at the gate for a moment. He looked at Owen one more time. Owen was sitting on the white oak step with his coffee mug, not looking at Daniel specifically, just being present in the way that doesn't need to be explained. Daniel nodded once, got in his car, and drove away. Ruth came through her gate and sat down on the step beside Owen without asking. She said, he won't come back. How do you know? Because that was the first time I said it to him like I meant it for myself. Not to be done with him. For myself. Owen said, there's a difference. All the difference, she said. Fletcher came and settled at her feet like the question had been answered before any of them said it out loud. The year turned. The library shelves got finished and delivered. Ruth took on a consultancy project she could work from home and spent 3 mornings a week at Owen's kitchen table with her laptop while he worked in the garage because she said the coffee shop down the street was too loud and Owen's kitchen was quiet and the coffee was marginally better now that she had fixed the temperature issue with his machine. He let her say it was the coffee and did not point out that she also brought her own mug. By February, she had a key to the house because of Fletcher, who was 14 and a half and needed checking on, and by March, the key was being used for reasons that had nothing to do with Fletcher, and by May, they both knew the key wasn't the point. On a Saturday, in late June, exactly 1 year after Owen had watched her walk out onto the porch next door and pull the screen door shut like she'd done it 1,000 times before, they were in his back garden, the hostas properly watered, the porch steps solid, the fence between the properties still technically there but functionally meaningless, and Ruth was reading and Owen was treating a piece of elm he'd been putting off, and Fletcher was asleep in the sun, and the morning was warm and entirely unremarkable in every way except that Owen looked up from the wood grain and looked at her and thought that this was what he had been trying not to break. Not any given thing. This ordinary, specific, uncomplicated morning. He didn't say anything. He went inside and came back with 2 mugs of coffee that were the right temperature. He set hers on the arm of her chair.